and welcome to the next episode of our mini-series on epistemic injustice. This is episode 4, and in this episode, after our little detour into the world of formal modeling and mathematics, we are going to return to the more informal philosophical theory of epistemic injustice. In particular, we are going to talk about the agency of those who suffer from epistemic injustice. To illustrate this issue, I chose two topics. One is the pre-emption of testimony. The second is epistemic exploitation. These are both highly relevant to the agency that we ascribe to and expect from agents that are suffering from epistemic injustice. And we will see in a minute what all of that means. The phenomenon of epistemic preemption, I think, is in some sense something that we are all familiar with. It is also sometimes called by different names, like epistemic smothering and the like. I find epistemic preemption the most fitting term. So what is it? The idea is that an agent, in anticipation of their not being given enough credibility, does not even try to provide their testimony. This preemption to be actually an epistemic injustice, of course, the anticipation of being dismissed must be at least somewhat realistic, a kind of rational assumption. Let us consider a simple example. Imagine a person who is a member of a generally epistemically marginalized group, has been the witness of a crime, and is now asked by the police to testify on said crime. The calculation of that person might very well be that whatever they are going to testify to the police is not going to be taken with proper seriousness. Their credibility is going to be discounted, indeed. And hence, they make the overall calculation that it's not actually worth for them testifying. Now you might wonder, what exactly is the reasoning behind that? Because you could think that even if their testimony is actually not taken seriously, what is the cost of providing it? Why not just testify on the off chance of being heard? You can distinguish in this case two different kinds of costs that might play into the calculation of the agent not to want to make a testimony. The first one that we are here less interested in is their generally, presumably warranted distrust in the police to do things with their testimony that are simply not in their material interest. So, at the very least, they might be taken to court, they might become a suspect themselves, and all other kinds of unpleasantness. Now, that is a pretty good reason not to provide testimony, I would say, but it's not really what we are focused on so much because it's not really an epistemic issue per se. But there is another issue, and that is the psychological cost of providing one's testimony and having it being discredited or even ignored. This goes at the heart of what motivated the theory of epistemic injustice in the beginning, namely that human beings are knowers in a very essential way. They require their identity as knowers to be acknowledged for their feeling of self-worth and the proper pursuit of their activities as knowers. And hence, being discredited, being not believed when one deserves to be believed, are costs to a human or generally any epistemic agent as such. Now there are two aspects of epistemic preemption, testimonial preemption, that are especially interesting. Let me start with the first one, which is that the testimony is never ever even given. Even more, the agent not choosing to testify might not even form the relevant underlying belief explicitly. In turn, if we are after the fact trying to correct for that testimonial injustice, the relevant testimony is not there to correct on. And indeed, especially if the person is for whatever reason not available anymore, it might be impossible to reconstruct what they could have said or might have said. Not even introducing the issue that the person at a future point in time, when asked again to testify, might actually testify in quite a different way, hence making it impossible to reconstruct the original testimony and correct for that testimonial injustice. The second issue is more directly relevant to the topic of this episode, namely the agency of the speaker, or not speaker in this case. Because we might wonder what, as an audience, we are supposed to do if we don't even receive the testimony in that moment. We can ask if there is not some kind of obligation on the part of the epistemically marginalized speaker to provide their testimony, to give us a chance to give proper credit. And otherwise, if there is not a situation created in which neither the speaker nor the audience really bears responsibility, because the speaker has the rational expectation that the audience would not listen to them, but the audience is not guilty of testimonial injustice because they never actually form a deficient credibility judgment of the speaker, because they are not even asked to do so. So it seems that we might end up with a situation where some kind of epistemic injustice, or testimonial injustice more particular, takes place, but nobody can be pointed at as being guilty of it. So let us turn to the second issue of this episode, epistemic exploitation. As the name suggests, we are talking about a kind of exploitation, so making use of the labor of a person in a way that is detrimental to the person and or not sufficiently compensated. And the kind of labor that we are talking about in this context is, of course, any kind of epistemic labor, so labor of providing knowledge in a broad sense, I would say, or to acquire knowledge or anything along those lines. A typical context in which epistemic exploitation takes place is when a person is hired for their identity as a kind of token representative or to satisfy some kind of quota, resulting in a work environment where that person is the only or one of a very small number comparatively members of their identity group. So this happened, and in many cases is still happening, in a lot of cases with ethnic minorities. It was in the past also very common with women, obviously. A little less common in that area, but still, if you're looking, for example, at corporate boards, it could still be the case. So a person who is in this kind of token position is often asked, over and above the usual activities, to represent the standpoint of the group that they are a member of. So you are not, say, for example, simply an American college, a black professor who does the epistemic work of a professor, but you are also perceived as a representative of the black community, and hence you are supposed to do the epistemic labor of a representative of that group to make it accessible to the peer group at the university and the academic community. And certainly that is an additional piece of work, and it is usually not explicitly even acknowledged and certainly not compensated. The issue here is that, to stick with the example of the professor, that person is required to do additional work that is not properly compensated, and that also detracts generally from their time to pursue their academic career in a way that is not demanded from their colleagues. Now, one of the things that makes epistemic exploitation a difficult topic is that the person who is epistemically exploited, as this example shows, is in a certain sense already kind of privileged. Right? It is the person who is hired for the higher class job, in a sense, that is already elevated from the group outside of their otherwise epistemic marginalization. And hence, there is a certain kind of tension between the complaint, being epistemically exploited, and on the other hand, being already a privileged person that is elevated above other members of that group. The second problem is the actual representativeness of the person elevated in that place. This is again very well illustrated by the example of the black professor. That person is probably not the most representative of their group. That is kind of inherently the case almost, because the group is epistemically marginalized and the person is elevated to a position of great, at least epistemic privilege, a college professor. So we are struggling with the issue of having a person here that is demanded to represent the group, but is in a certain sense not necessarily in the best position to do so, and might be themselves aware that they are not in the best position to do so, and hence unwilling to do so. So we can see again an interesting issue about the agency of the subject of the epistemic injustice. On the one hand, that person is highly epistemically privileged by assumption. Right? They are asked to provide their testimony, to provide their standpoint, to contribute in a certain way at least to the collective discourse, but at the same time they are being epistemically exploited. They are asked to perform epistemic labor that they are not properly compensated or acknowledged for. And this creates, once again, a certain kind of tension. The tension is a bit different than in the case of epistemic preemption, because it seems, at least at a first glance, that the epistemically exploited agent has a lot more agency than the preempted one. But if we look closer, they find themselves in a kind of web of demands, requirements that are being made on them that makes their position also quite difficult. They cannot really refuse the role of the spokesperson because that will only lead into further marginalization of the group that they ask to represent. But at the same time, they feel, both due to the issue of epistemic exploitation and the problem of actual proper representation, not in a good position or not willing to do that epistemic labor. At this point, I owe you an explanation what cases of preemption and cases of epistemic exploitation have in common indeed. In both, it seems that the epistemic agent, who is a victim of epistemic injustice, is between a rock and a hard place. The whole network of requirements, external pressures, obligations, puts them into a position where neither of their option seems to be good. In the case of epistemic preemption, the person giving testimony will result in them being discredited and in that sense harmed as a knower, but them not providing testimony obviously robs them entirely of their epistemic agency. In the case of epistemic exploitation, the two options are a bit different, but still there are two options who both seem bad. The epistemic agent can either give in to the epistemic exploitation and suffer the negative consequences of that, or refuse the epistemic exploitation and hence give up on the opportunity to represent a marginalized group and potentially fix some of the misperceptions. The second part is especially difficult because there might be expectations of that very marginalized group on the selected representative to give a better picture of their standpoint. So there might be a lot of pressure, not only from the privileged colleagues of the representative, but also from the marginalized members of their group to offer that representation and undergo the epistemic exploitation. Again, between a rock and a hard place. Looking from the outside as observers, we also find these cases difficult to adjudicate because we can see the downsides of both options. On the one hand, we feel that it would be good, that it would be commendable for the testifier in the case of preemption to at least provide their testimony in a best effort to create communication, while at the same time we see the futility, or the potential futility at least from their perspective, of this effort and the cost that they would have to undergo. Similarly, in the case of epistemic exploitation, looking on from the outside, it seems that there is a kind of obligation, especially towards the members of the marginalized group that they are supposed to represent, to speak up, to provide insight on the standpoint of that group to the more privileged surroundings of the selected speaker, so to say. And at the same time, especially if we make the comparison to the more privileged colleagues of the selected speaker of the epistemically marginalized group, it seems a very unfair and exploitative demand to make on them. I will not be able, within the confines of this little podcast, to resolve this issue entirely, but maybe I can provide a little bit of advice how to look at these situations and maybe even resolve them, and at least make it more understandable why the issue is so complicated. To do so, first look at a general heuristic for the resolution of injustice. It seems a pretty good heuristic to assume that the obligation to deal with an injustice lies with the powerful. This is certainly true if they are themselves responsible for the injustice, but even if they are not, they seem to have the most capacity to deal with the injustice, so the obligations lie with them. I think this is a generally good heuristic to think about injustice and the resolution of injustices, but I believe that in the current context there are a few shortcomings if we limit ourselves to this particular perspective. The first issue seems with the conception of the agency of those who suffer epistemic injustice. If we focus on the powerful, the non-marginalized, and their agency, we seem to be missing out on the agency that those suffering the epistemic injustice have to amend it themselves. Now, this should be seen less of an obligation of them to act, but more of an issue of our conceptualization that they can indeed act, and that they should be involved, they should be allowed to act. And the conditions should be created for them to act, not just for those who hold more power, who are not marginalized, to act on themselves, but again, to create the conditions to act together to resolve the injustice. So this is one additional heuristic I believe that we need to take into account when we are thinking about resolving epistemic injustice in these kinds of cases. Now, the second issue applies primarily to cases of epistemic exploitation, though we can also see it in some cases of preemption. And that is that there is somewhat of an obligation, somewhat of a duty to perform the epistemic labor, not towards those who are epistemically more privileged, or generally more privileged, than the agent in question, the agent in the difficult situation, but towards those who they are taken to represent. Now, this is clearly a case of an imperfect justice, right? The agent in this position is not able and cannot be asked to fully amend the injustice that is taking place, but at the same time, this does not alleviate them entirely of any obligation to those who are even more marginalized, who are even less privileged, who are even more disadvantaged in society. There is a certain obligation, certain duty to perform the labor to support those. This is not in conflict with the claim that there is even more such of an obligation to those who are even more advantaged, who are even more privileged. But these things are not mutually exclusive. Not all of the obligation to resolve injustice lies with the absolutely most powerful. It should be seen as distributed along the lines of who is how advantaged and disadvantaged. The more advantaged you are, the more obligation you have to resolve injustice. The more disadvantaged you are, the less of such an obligation can be imposed on you. That, I think, is an additional important heuristic to analyze these cases of epistemic injustice. And so, we conclude with the idea that while the agents that we are looking at are, as I said before, between a rock and a hard place, doesn't mean that they have no agency, that they should be understood as having no agency, and hence also that they should be understood as having a certain level of obligation towards others to resolve injustice within the means that they have been given. Again, notwithstanding the bigger obligations of others. This is it for this episode. Thank you for your attention. In the last couple of episodes of our mini-series, we are going to dive into some interviews. One on the issue of hermeneutical injustice in the realm of mental disorder. The second on the epistemic injustice towards animals. So see you then. Have a good time.